September 12, 1987, Cedar Falls, Iowa. 24-year-old Rebecca Martinez vanished during her engagement party at the local VFW hall. Her car remained in the parking lot, keys still dangling from the ignition, while Def Leppard's "Pour Some Sugar on Me" echoed from the abandoned celebration inside. The VFW hall on Sycamore Street buzzed with the kind of energy that only comes from celebrating love in a small Iowa town. September 12, 1987 was supposed to be perfect for Rebecca Martinez, 24 years old, with dark hair feathered just right and wearing her best dress, a powder blue number she'd saved 3 paychecks to buy. She should have been the happiest woman in Cedar Falls. The engagement party her future mother-in-law had insisted on throwing was everything Rebecca had dreamed of since she was a little girl playing dress-up in her mother's jewelry. Red, white and blue streamers hung from the acoustic ceiling tiles, competing with the glow of neon Budweiser and Miller Lite signs that cast everything in carnival colors. The smell of cigarette smoke mixed with Aquanet hairspray created that distinctly 80s atmosphere that would become nostalgic decades later, but felt vibrantly alive that night. Someone had brought a boom box, and it sat on the bar playing a mixtape that jumped from Madonna to Bon Jovi to George Strait, trying to please everyone's musical taste. Rebecca moved through the crowd like she was floating, accepting congratulations and showing off the modest diamond ring that caught the light every time she gestured. Her fiancé, Tommy Brennan, 26 and still carrying himself with the confident swagger of a former high school quarterback, kept one arm around her waist and a beer in his free hand. They looked like the kind of couple that belonged together, him with his sandy brown hair and easy smile, her with those expressive dark eyes that lit up when she laughed. But even in moments of celebration, undercurrents run deep in small towns. Jake Brennan nursed his third bourbon and coke at the far end of the bar, watching his older brother with something that wasn't quite happiness. At 24, Jake had always lived in Tommy's shadow, second best at football, second choice for the better jobs at the grain elevator, and apparently second in line for Rebecca's heart. The resemblance between the brothers was strong enough that people sometimes mistook one for the other from a distance, but up close, Jake's features were sharper, his eyes a little harder, his smile less frequent. Rebecca's best friend Sandra Miller flitted between conversations, making sure everyone had drinks and that the potluck table stayed organized. Sandra had been Rebecca's constant companion since 3rd grade, the quiet one who did the planning while Rebecca got the attention. Tonight, Sandra wore a green dress that complemented her red hair, but somehow she seemed to blend into the background even as she orchestrated the evening's success. She kept checking her watch, a nervous habit that had gotten worse lately. The music shifted to Def Leppard's "Pour Some Sugar on Me," and the younger crowd pressed toward the makeshift dance floor. Rebecca grabbed Tommy's hand, pulling him into the writhing mass of bodies, her laughter rising above the drums and guitars. For a moment, everything seemed exactly as it should be, youth and love and possibility spinning together under the harsh fluorescent lights that the streamers couldn't quite soften. Around 10 o'clock, the party hit its stride. Rebecca's uncle had brought out his camera, the kind with the bulb flash that left everyone blinking purple spots, and he was documenting everything like it was a royal wedding. Mrs. Brennan was telling anyone who would listen about the church ceremony they were planning for next June. The men had gravitated toward the bar and the dartboard, arguing good-naturedly about the Cubs' chances of making anything of their season. But Rebecca seemed restless. She kept stepping away from conversations, checking the time, glancing toward the exit. Sandra always noticed, and followed her friend's gaze toward the parking lot visible through the hall's front windows. The lot was full of the kind of cars that defined working-class America in 1987. Chevrolets and Fords, pickup trucks with toolboxes, a few attempts at sportiness like Tommy's red Camaro. At 10:30, Rebecca whispered something to Tommy and headed for the door, fishing a pack of Virginia Slims from her small purse. The night air was crisp with the promise of autumn, carrying the scent of dying leaves and distant wood smoke. She stood under the single streetlight in the parking lot, the orange glow making her dress look almost silver. That was the last time anyone who loved her saw Rebecca Martinez alive. Detective Ray Kowalski had seen enough small-town secrets in his 15 years with the Cedar Falls Police Department to know that the pretty surface of any story usually hid something uglier underneath. When he sat across from Tommy and Jake Brennan, in the station's cramped interview room 3 days after Rebecca's disappearance, he could feel the tension between the brothers like electricity before a storm. The interview room hadn't been updated since the 1970s, with wood paneling that had gone from fashionable to dated to almost retro again. The fluorescent light above flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows across the brothers' faces. Tommy sat forward in his chair, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Jake leaned back with studied casualness, but his leg bounced constantly under the metal table. "Tell me about your relationship with Rebecca," Kowalski said, his pen poised over a yellow legal pad. He was old school, preferred taking notes by hand rather than relying on the tape recorder that sat silent in the corner. People sometimes forget about handwritten notes. Tommy's voice cracked slightly when he spoke. We've been together for 2 years, met at the Dairy Queen where she worked summers. I knew right away she was special. He glanced at his brother, something flickering across his face. Jake introduced us, actually. That got Kowalski's attention. He'd learned that the most important information often came in throwaway comments, casual admissions that people didn't realize were significant. How did you know Rebecca, Jake? Jake's legs stopped bouncing. We went out a few times in high school, nothing serious. When I saw her again last year working at the DQ, I thought Tommy might like her. The words came out too practiced, too careful. But Tommy's head snapped toward his brother like he'd been slapped. A few times. You dated her for 3 months, Jake. Don't make it sound like nothing. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Kowalski set down his pen and leaned back, letting the silence do its work. He'd found that people couldn't stand quiet spaces. They felt compelled to fill them, usually with more truth than they'd intended to share. It was high school, Jake said finally. Ancient history. She chose you, didn't she? Yeah, she chose me. Tommy's voice carried an edge that suggested this wasn't the first time they'd had this conversation. Just like she chose me for homecoming senior year when you thought you had it locked up. Just like she chose me when you brought her around again. Kowalski made a note. Rivalry runs deep. He'd grown up in a family of 4 boys himself, and he recognized the particular brand of competition that could turn siblings into something approaching enemies. How did you feel about your brother's engagement, Jake? Jake shrugged, but his jaw was tight. Happy for them, why wouldn't I be? Because you were still in love with her, Tommy said quietly. It wasn't an accusation, it was a statement of fact that seemed to surprise even him with its certainty. The brothers stared at each other across the table while the fluorescent light flickered overhead. Kowalski could hear the muffled sounds of the station beyond the door, phones ringing, radio chatter, the everyday business of small-town policing continuing while Rebecca Martinez remained missing. That's not true, Jake said, but his denial lacked conviction. Come on, Jake, you think I'm blind? The way you looked at her at the party, the way you've looked at her every time we've all been together for the past 2 years. Tommy's voice was gaining strength, like saying the words out loud was helping him understand something he'd been trying not to see. You brought her around because you thought she'd pick you again, and when she didn't, you couldn't let it go. Jake stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. You don't know what you're talking about. Sit down, Kowalski said firmly. We're not done here. Jake remained standing for a moment, his hands clenched at his sides. Then he sank back into the chair, suddenly looking younger than his 24 years. Fine, maybe I still had feelings for her. So what? She was marrying you, I accepted that. Did you? Tommy asked. Because I'm starting to remember things differently. Like how you always found excuses to stop by when I wasn't around. How you knew her work schedule better than I did sometimes. How she got weird and distant whenever your name came up. Kowalski made another note, Tommy's suspicions growing. He'd seen this before. Traumatic events had a way of making people re-examine everything they thought they knew, finding patterns they'd been too trusting or too busy to notice before. Where were you between 10:30 and midnight on Saturday, Jake? Kowalski asked. At the party, you can ask anyone. I have asked people. Several guests saw you leave around 10:15, not long before Rebecca went outside. Jake's face went pale. I went out for air, came back 10 minutes later. Convenient timing, Tommy said, his voice barely above a whisper, right when she disappeared. You think I hurt her? Jake's voice rose. She's the only woman I ever loved, Tommy, the only one who ever mattered. I wouldn't hurt the hair on her head. The admission hung in the room like smoke. Both brothers seemed stunned by its honesty, by the way it laid bare years of careful pretense and polite fiction. Kowalski had found what he was looking for, the crack in the surface that would let him see what was really underneath. But you might hurt someone who was hurting her, Kowalski suggested, or someone who was keeping her from you. The brothers looked at each other across the scarred table, and Kowalski saw something shift between them. Trust, maybe, or the last remnants of family loyalty. Whatever it was breaking apart in real time, dissolved by suspicion and the terrible possibility that one of them might know more about Rebecca's disappearance than he was saying. The Cedar Falls Police Department's evidence room was little more than a converted closet, shelves lined with cardboard boxes and manila folders that documented the small crimes and occasional tragedies of rural Iowa life. Detective Kowalski spread witness statements across his desk like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, trying to construct those final crucial hours when Rebecca Martinez had vanished into the September night. The payphone booth outside the VFW hall had become an unexpected focal point of his investigation. 3 different witnesses mentioned seeing someone use it between 10 and 11 p.m., though none could identify who. The phone itself stood like a lonely sentinel under the streetlight, its metal surface reflecting the orange glow. When Kowalski had examined it, he'd found quarters scattered on the asphalt around its base, as if someone had dropped them in haste or anger. Sandra Miller's statement troubled him most. Rebecca's best friend had been the last person to have a real conversation with her, and Sandra's account felt somehow incomplete. She described Rebecca as nervous and distracted throughout the evening, constantly checking the time and stepping away from conversations. But when Kowalski pressed for specifics, Sandra became vague, claiming she'd been too busy hostessing to pay close attention. She seemed like she was waiting for something, Sandra had said during her interview, sitting in the same wooden chair where the Brennan brothers had faced off. Or someone. I asked her about it, but she just said she was fine. You know how Rebecca was, always keeping things to herself when she was worried. The timing bothered Kowalski. According to multiple witnesses, Rebecca had gone outside around 10:30, ostensibly to smoke a cigarette, but Rebecca's mother had been adamant that her daughter had quit smoking 6 months earlier, part of her effort to get in shape for the wedding. So why had she been carrying Virginia Slims in her purse? Mrs. Henderson, who lived in the apartment above the hardware store across from the VFW, provided the most intriguing detail. She'd been watching television with her window open when she heard voices in the parking lot, a man and woman arguing, though she couldn't make out the words. The argument had lasted several minutes before ending abruptly with the sound of car doors slamming and an engine starting. It was around 10:45, Mrs. Henderson had told him, her weathered hands folded in her lap. I remember because I was watching the news and they were just starting the weather report. That's when everything went quiet outside, too quiet if you know what I mean. Tommy Brennan's alibi was solid until 10:30. Dozens of people could vouch for his presence inside the hall, dancing with Rebecca, posing for pictures, accepting congratulations. But after Rebecca went outside, his whereabouts became hazier. He claimed to have stayed inside, playing darts with his cousins and drinking beer with his father. Yet when Kowalski interviewed the cousins separately, their stories didn't quite align. One said Tommy had stepped out to the bathroom around 10:40. Another mentioned him being unusually quiet during the dart game. Jake Brennan's movements were even more suspicious. He definitely left the party around 10:15, claiming he needed fresh air and to make a phone call. But the payphone's records showed no calls made during that time period, and Jake couldn't explain the discrepancy. When he returned to the hall around 11, several witnesses noted that his shirt was wrinkled and his hair disheveled, as if he'd been in some kind of physical altercation. The most haunting piece of evidence was Rebecca's car itself. Her Honda Civic sat in the VFW parking lot exactly where she'd parked it hours earlier, keys dangling from the ignition like she'd stepped away for just a moment. Her purse remained on the passenger seat, wallet intact with $43 and her driver's license. But her cigarettes were gone, and there was something else that nagged at Kowalski. The driver's seat was adjusted forward, as if someone shorter than Rebecca had been sitting in it. Rebecca stood 5'6" in her stocking feet. Tommy was 6'1", Jake was 5'11", and Sandra Miller was barely 5'3". If someone else had driven the car after Rebecca disappeared, it narrowed the list of possibilities considerably. The physical evidence was frustratingly limited by 1987's forensic capabilities. They dusted the car for fingerprints and found dozens, Rebecca's, Tommy's, Jake's, Sandra's, and several others belonging to family and friends who'd been passengers at various times. Without more sophisticated analysis, it was impossible to determine which prints were recent and which were days or weeks old. Kowalski had also found something else that bothered him: fresh cigarette butts near the payphone, but not Virginia Slims. These were Marlboro Lights, and they showed evidence of having been smoked by someone with nervous habits, deeply inhaled, stubbed out early, the filter compressed by anxious fingers. Sandra Miller smoked Marlboro Lights. The detective stood in the parking lot as the sun set on his 4th day of investigation, trying to visualize those missing minutes between 10:30 and midnight. Rebecca had come outside, probably to meet someone rather than to smoke. There had been an argument, possibly a physical confrontation. Then silence, broken only by the sound of car doors and an engine starting. But whose car, and where was Rebecca Martinez? The autumn wind picked up, scattering dead leaves across the asphalt where Rebecca had last been seen alive. Kowalski pulled his jacket tighter and headed back to his cruiser, the weight of unanswered questions pressing down on him like the darkening sky. In small towns, secrets had a way of staying buried, sometimes forever. But he wasn't ready to give up on Rebecca yet, not when the truth felt so close he could almost touch it, scattered around that payphone booth like fallen quarters, waiting for someone to put the pieces together in just the right way. The Stardust Motel sat on the edge of Cedar Falls like a relic from a more optimistic era, its neon sign flickering pink and blue against the grey October sky. Built in the 1960s when the interstate was new and traveling salesmen still needed places to rest their heads, it had aged into the kind of establishment that rented rooms by the hour and didn't ask too many questions about the names in the register. Detective Kowalski pushed through the glass door of the office, breathing in the stale mixture of cigarette smoke and industrial carpet cleaner that seemed permanently embedded in the walls. The clerk behind the desk looked up from a wood-grain television that was showing a rerun of The Price is Right, the sound barely audible above the hum of a struggling air conditioning unit. "Help you?" the clerk asked. He was maybe 60, with thinning hair and the kind of resignation that comes from seeing too much of humanity's messier side. Kowalski showed his badge and pulled out 2 photographs, Rebecca Martinez smiling at the camera and Jake Brennan in his high school graduation photo. "Either of these people look familiar to you?" The clerk studied the pictures with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to remember faces for professional reasons. "Yeah, I know them, the girl and the younger guy. They've been coming here maybe once a week for the past month and a half. Always paid cash, always left clean. Quiet." "How quiet?" "Never any trouble. Sometimes I'd see them talking in the parking lot before they went to the room. She seemed upset a couple times, like they were arguing about something, but it never got loud enough to bother other guests." Kowalski made notes on his pad, trying to keep his expression neutral despite the significance of what he was hearing. "When was the last time you saw them?" "Week before that girl went missing, maybe September 5th or 6th. She seemed more upset than usual that day, kept checking her watch, looking around like she expected someone to show up." The motel room Jake and Rebecca had used was number 12, at the far end of the building where the parking lot curved behind a stand of pine trees. Kowalski examined it with the clerk's permission, noting how it provided complete privacy from the road. The room itself was exactly what he'd expected, a double bed with a brown and orange comforter that had seen better decades, a small table with a built-in ashtray and a television bolted to a metal stand. But it was the personal touches that told the real story. In the wastebasket, he found the remnants of complimentary coffee packets and sugar sachets, as if someone had been nervous enough to need caffeine but too distracted to finish drinking it. On the nightstand, a circular water stain suggested glasses had been set down without coasters, 2 glasses, based on the overlapping rings. The most damning evidence came from the motel's guest register, which the clerk had maintained with surprising diligence. The signatures for room 12 showed a progression that told its own story. The first few entries were signed Mr. and Mrs. Johnson in Jake's handwriting, but as the weeks progressed, the signatures became increasingly careless, eventually just J. Brennan with no attempt at deception. Armed with this new information, Kowalski drove to the grain elevator where Jake worked the day shift. The building rose against the horizon like a concrete monument to agricultural prosperity, surrounded by the kind of trucks and machinery that kept rural Iowa running. He found Jake in the loading bay, his work clothes dusty with grain particles, his face dark with something beyond the shadows cast by the overhead lights. "We need to talk," Kowalski said. Jake glanced around at his co-workers, then nodded toward a small office area away from the noise of the machinery. The office smelled of motor oil and coffee, with calendars featuring farm equipment and a radio playing country music at low volume. "I know about the motel," Kowalski said without preamble. "The Stardust, room 12, you and Rebecca every week for over a month." Jake's shoulders sagged as if he'd been carrying a weight too heavy to bear any longer. "How did you find out?" "Good police work. The question is, why didn't you tell me about it before?" Jake sank into a metal folding chair, suddenly looking older than his 24 years. "Because I knew how it would look, because I knew it would make everything worse for everyone." "Tell me about the relationship." "It wasn't supposed to happen." Jake's voice was barely above a whisper. "I mean it, detective. I introduced her to Tommy because I thought they'd be good together. I thought maybe if she was happy with him, I could finally get over her." "But that's not what happened." "No," Jake rubbed his face with hands that were permanently stained with grain dust. "She started coming by my apartment in August, said she needed to talk to someone, that she was having doubts about the engagement, about Tommy, about everything." Kowalski waited, letting Jake find his own words. "At first, it really was just talking. She'd sit on my couch and tell me how Tommy was pressuring her about the wedding, about moving to Des Moines where he could get a better job, about having kids right away. She felt trapped, like her whole life was being planned out without anyone asking what she wanted. And then one afternoon in late August, she was crying about something Tommy had said, and I put my arms around her to comfort her and," Jake trailed off, "you know the rest." "Were you in love with her?" "I never stopped being in love with her. From the first time I saw her in high school until she disappeared, she was everything good in the world, detective, everything I wanted and couldn't have. Did she love you back? Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. She said she did, but she also said she couldn't break up with Tommy, couldn't hurt him like that. She kept saying we had to stop meeting, that it wasn't fair to anyone. But then she'd show up at my door again and we'd end up at that motel room trying to figure out what we were supposed to do. What happened the night she disappeared? I was supposed to meet her outside during the party. We'd planned it earlier that week. She was going to tell Tommy about us finally ending the engagement, but when I got outside she was already talking to someone else. Kowalski leaned forward. Who? I couldn't see clearly from where I was standing, but it was definitely a woman, someone shorter than Rebecca. They were arguing about something, voices getting louder. By the time I got close enough to intervene, Rebecca was gone, just gone, like she'd vanished into thin air. Did you see the woman's face? Jake shook his head. It was too dark and she was wearing a hat or something. But detective, I swear in my life I didn't hurt Rebecca. I loved her more than anything, I still do. As Kowalski drove back to the station, the pieces of the puzzle were rearranging themselves in his mind. The love triangle had been more complex than anyone had initially realized, with Rebecca caught between two brothers while harboring feelings that she couldn't reconcile with her sense of loyalty and obligation. But if Jake was telling the truth about seeing someone else argue with Rebecca, then the investigation was about to take another unexpected turn. The question was no longer just which brother had killed Rebecca Martinez. The question was whether either of them had killed her at all. Tommy Brennan's red 1985 Camaro sat in his driveway like evidence of better times, its metallic paint dulled by a week of autumn rain and neglect. When Detective Kowalski pulled up to the small rental house on Elm Street, he could hear the muffled sound of music coming from inside, the same Def Leppard song that had been playing when Rebecca disappeared. The sound repeated, stopped, then started again, as if someone was playing the same cassette tape over and over. Tommy answered the door on the fourth knock, and Kowalski was struck by how much the young man had changed in just 7 days. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by hollow eyes, and the kind of stubble that suggested personal hygiene had become less important than whatever was eating at him from the inside. He wore the same clothes he'd had on the day before when Kowalski had interviewed him at the station, and the house behind him looked like a place where someone was falling apart in slow motion. "We need to talk about your brother's confession," Kowalski said. Tommy stepped aside to let him in, then immediately walked to the boom box on the kitchen counter and punched the stop button. The sudden silence felt oppressive, like the house was holding its breath. "What confession?" Tommy asked, but his voice lacked conviction. "About the affair, about the weekly meetings at the Stardust Motel, about Rebecca planning to break up with you the night she disappeared." Tommy's laugh was bitter and hollow. "So he finally told you. I was wondering when he'd work up the courage." "You knew?" Tommy walked to the refrigerator and pulled out a beer, his third empty bottle already sitting on the counter even though it wasn't yet noon. "I suspected. Hell, maybe I knew and just didn't want to admit it to myself. You want to know the truth, detective? I probably knew from the first time she came home with that look on her face." "What look?" "Guilty, like she'd been somewhere she shouldn't have been, doing something she shouldn't have been doing. Women get a certain look when they're keeping secrets. My mom had the same look when she was sneaking around with the insurance salesman before she left my dad." Kowalski sat down at the small kitchen table, noting the stack of unpaid bills and the ashtray overflowing with cigarette butts. Tommy had started smoking again, despite Rebecca's efforts to get him to quit. "If you suspected, why didn't you confront them?" "Because I didn't want to lose her," Tommy's voice cracked. "Because I thought if I ignored it, maybe it would go away. Maybe she'd realize that Jake was just a phase, that what we had was real and worth saving." "But it didn't go away." "No, it got worse. She started picking fights with me about stupid stuff. The wedding plans, where we were going to live, what kind of furniture we'd buy. Like she was trying to make me mad enough to break up with her so she wouldn't have to do it herself." Tommy took a long drink of beer and stared out the kitchen window at his neighbor's yard, where children's toys lay scattered across brown grass. "The worst part was pretending I didn't know, pretending to be happy about the engagement party when I knew she was planning to humiliate me in front of everyone we'd ever known." "Is that why you followed her outside?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Tommy set down his beer with careful precision, as if making too sudden a movement might shatter something fragile. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I followed her outside." "What did you see?" "I saw her talking to someone by the payphone. At first I thought it was Jake, but then I realized it was a woman. They were arguing about something, getting pretty heated. I was going to walk over there and find out what was going on, but then I heard Rebecca say something that stopped me cold.
What did she say?
Tommy was quiet for so long that Kowalski wondered if he'd decided not to answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. She said, "I can't keep lying to everyone, especially not to him." And I knew she was talking about me. I knew she was finally going to tell people about Jake, about the affair, about how she'd been making a fool of me for months.
What happened then?
I went back inside. I couldn't handle hearing the rest of it. I went to the bar and drank 3 shots of whiskey in 5 minutes, trying to numb the pain of knowing my life was about to fall apart in front of everyone I'd grown up with.
Several witnesses say you seemed agitated when you came back inside.
Agitated? Tommy laughed harshly. I was dying, detective. Everything I thought was real, everything I'd planned for the future, it was all just an illusion. Rebecca never loved me, not really. She loved Jake, probably always had. I was just the consolation prize, the safe choice, the brother who could provide for her while Jake figured out what he wanted to do with his life. Kowalski made notes, but he was also studying Tommy's body language, listening for the subtle tells that separated truth from fiction. You never went back outside.
No, I stayed at that bar until people started leaving, until my dad came over and told me Rebecca was missing. But you knew she was planning to break up with you.
I suspected she was planning to break up with me.
There's a difference.
Is there? Because from where I sit, it looks like you had motive, opportunity, and a history of losing your temper when things didn't go your way.
Tommy's face flushed red. What's that supposed to mean?
Your high school disciplinary record, 3 suspensions for fighting, the incident at Murphy's bar last spring when you put a guy through a window because he was talking to Rebecca. That was different. That guy was all over her, wouldn't take no for an answer.
Maybe Rebecca wouldn't take no for an answer either. Maybe she insisted on ending the engagement, and you couldn't handle the humiliation.
Tommy stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. You think I killed her? You think I could hurt the only woman I ever loved? I think love and anger sometimes get tangled up in ways that make people do things they never thought they were capable of.
Well, you're wrong. Tommy's voice was steadier now, filled with the kind of conviction that comes from absolute certainty.
I didn't kill Rebecca, detective, but I know who did.
Who?
Whoever she was arguing with by that payphone. Find that woman and you'll find Rebecca's killer. As Kowalski drove away from Tommy's house, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just heard something important. The problem was figuring out what it meant. Tommy's grief seemed genuine, but then again, so did his anger. And in Kowalski's experience, grief and anger were sometimes just different faces of the same destructive emotion. The cassette tape of Rebecca and Tommy's song had started playing again before he'd even reached the end of the block, the sound following him down Elm Street like an accusation he couldn't quite answer. By Christmas of 1987, the Rebecca Martinez case had settled into that liminal space between active investigation and cold case, existing somewhere in the grey area where hope hadn't quite died, but optimism was becoming harder to sustain. Detective Ray Kowalski kept the file on his desk rather than relegating it to the evidence room, a physical reminder of promises he'd made to Rebecca's mother that he wasn't sure he could keep. The town had moved on in the way small towns do, with new scandals and tragedies gradually taking precedence over old mysteries. The VFW hall hosted other parties, other celebrations, and people stopped mentioning Rebecca's name in casual conversation, but the absence lingered like a low-grade fever, affecting everyone who'd known her in ways they didn't always recognize or acknowledge. Tommy Brennan had left town in November, taking a job with a construction crew working on maldevelopments in the Des Moines suburbs. He'd sold his Camaro to pay for the move, but neighbors reported that he'd played that Def Leppard cassette one final time before loading his belongings into a borrowed pickup truck. The house on Elm Street stood empty, its for rent sign faded by winter weather and neglect. Jake Brennan had stayed in Cedar Falls, but something fundamental had broken in him. His supervisor at the grain elevator noted that his work remained competent but joyless, performed with the mechanical precision of someone going through the motions of living without really participating in it. He'd stopped going to Murphy's bar on Friday nights, stopped playing softball with the church league, stopped engaging in the social rituals that defined small-town existence for men his age. The brothers never spoke to each other again. When Tommy returned for their father's funeral in 1994, Jake left before the service began, choosing to pay his respects privately rather than share the same space with the brother he believed had stolen and lost the only woman either of them had ever really loved. Sandra Miller had perhaps changed the most visibly. Rebecca's best friend had always been quiet, but after the disappearance she became almost ghostly, speaking only when spoken to and avoiding the places where she and Rebecca had spent time together. She'd moved to a different apartment across town, claiming she needed a fresh start, but people who knew her well said she seemed to be running from something rather than running towards something new. Detective Kowalski interviewed Sandra multiple times throughout the winter and spring of 1988, always with the feeling that she was holding something back. Her statements remained consistent but somehow incomplete, like a puzzle with one crucial piece missing. She described Rebecca as nervous and distracted at the engagement party, but when pressed for specifics she became vague and evasive. "I keep thinking there's something I should remember," Sandra had said during their final interview in May of 1988. "Some detail that would make everything clear, but the harder I try to remember, the more confused I get." The physical evidence had yielded nothing useful with the forensic capabilities available in the late 1980s. Rebecca's car had been processed thoroughly, but the dozens of fingerprints found inside belonged to people who had legitimate reasons to be there. The cigarette butts near the payphone had been collected and catalogued, but without DNA analysis, they were just tobacco and paper that might or might not be connected to the case. Kowalski had expanded the investigation beyond Cedar Falls, checking with law enforcement agencies throughout Iowa and neighboring states for similar disappearances or unsolved murders. He'd found several cases that shared superficial similarities, young women who'd vanished without a trace, often in circumstances suggesting they'd left voluntarily rather than by force, but none of the details quite matched and none of the leads had panned out. The most frustrating aspect of the case was how close the solution felt. Kowalski had the distinct impression that everyone involved knew more than they were saying, that the truth was hiding just beneath the surface of polite cooperation and apparent concern, but knowing that secrets existed and being able to prove what they were turned out to be very different things. By 1990, other cases demanded his attention. A series of break-ins in the residential area near the college required immediate resources. A domestic violence situation escalated into something that made the regional news. A farm accident raised questions about safety violations and workers' compensation fraud. Rebecca Martinez became one file among many, her smiling photograph a constant but increasingly familiar presence in his peripheral vision. Detective Kowalski retired in December of 1995, 8 years after Rebecca's disappearance, with her case file among the boxes of unfinished business that haunted her career in law enforcement. He'd promised Rebecca's mother, Maria Martinez, that he would never stop looking for answers, but retirement had a way of making such promises feel both more precious and more fragile. Maria Martinez herself had become a fixture at the police department, stopping by monthly to ask about developments that both she and the officers knew were unlikely to materialize. She'd aged dramatically in the years since her daughter's disappearance, her dark hair going grey and her face acquiring the kind of lines that come from carrying weight that never gets lighter. She kept Rebecca's room exactly as it had been on September 12, 1987, as if maintaining the physical space might somehow preserve the possibility of return. The town's collective memory of Rebecca began to shift in subtle ways as the years passed. She became less a real person who had lived and worked and loved in Cedar Falls, and more a symbol of innocence lost, of youth cut short by unknown circumstances. Her high school graduation photo appeared on missing person flyers that gradually faded on telephone poles and bulletin boards, replaced by newer tragedies and more current concerns. But symbols, unlike people, don't age or change or disappoint. Rebecca Martinez became perfect in death in a way she'd never been allowed to be in life. The complexity of her relationship with the Brennan brothers, the uncertainty about her true feelings, the very human struggle to navigate conflicting desires and obligations, all of that messy reality was gradually smoothed away until only the tragedy remained, clean and simple and safely in the past. The VFW Hall was torn down in 1992 to make way for a small shopping plaza featuring a Pizza Hut and a video rental store. The payphone booth where someone had argued with Rebecca on her last night alive was relocated to the corner by the post office, where it served the community for another decade before being removed entirely as cell phones made such public conveniences obsolete. Sandra Miller married a man from Waterloo in 1993 and moved away from Cedar Falls, but she returned every September to place flowers at the small memorial that had been erected in Rebecca's honor in Sunset Park. She never spoke to reporters or investigators during these visits, simply left white roses, Rebecca's favorites, and departed without ceremony. The case file grew thicker over the years as Kowalski's successors added new witness interviews, follow-up reports on leads that went nowhere, and updates from missing persons databases that occasionally flagged similar cases in other jurisdictions. But the core mystery remained unchanged. What had happened to Rebecca Martinez during those crucial minutes between 10:30 and midnight on September 12, 1987? By the time Detective Maria Santos inherited the case in 2018, it had acquired the dusty quality of historical artifacts rather than active investigation. The original witnesses were scattered across the country or dead. The physical evidence sat in storage boxes in the basement of the police station, carefully preserved but technologically obsolete. The Brennan brothers had built separate lives in different states, connected only by their shared history of loving and losing the same woman. But Detective Santos brought something to the investigation that her predecessors hadn't possessed: access to forensic technologies that had been science fiction in 1987. DNA analysis had revolutionized criminal investigation since Rebecca's disappearance, and new techniques in genetic genealogy were solving cold cases that had seemed hopeless just a few years earlier. As Santos opened the evidence boxes in the basement storage room, breathing in the musty air and flickering fluorescent light that reminded her uncomfortably of a tomb, she wondered what secrets the intervening decades had preserved in those carefully labeled containers. Science had progressed, but human nature remained constant. Somewhere in those boxes, among the fingerprint cards and witness statements and faded photographs, was the truth about what had happened to Rebecca Martinez. The question was whether 31 years had been long enough for that truth to finally emerge from the shadows where it had been hiding all along. Detective Maria Santos had been working cold cases for 5 years when she first encountered the name Rebecca Martinez, but she'd been hearing echoes of the story her entire life. Growing up in Cedar Falls, she'd known about the young woman who'd vanished from her engagement party, the way children know about ghost stories and local legends, fragments of truth mixed with speculation and time. The basement storage room of the Cedar Falls Police Department smelled like old paper and forgotten secrets when Santos descended the concrete steps in January of 2019, armed with a requisition form and 32 years of accumulated forensic knowledge. The evidence boxes sat on metal shelving that had been installed sometime in the 1970s, each container labeled with case numbers and dates in the careful handwriting of long-retired officers. Box 87147 contained the physical remnants of Rebecca's last night: her purse, photographed and catalogued, the cigarette butts collected from near the payphone, fibers gathered from her abandoned Honda, and most importantly, the powder blue dress she'd been wearing earlier that evening, carefully folded and sealed in plastic that had yellowed with age. Santos spread the contents across a folding table she'd brought down from upstairs, creating a makeshift laboratory in the dim basement light. The dress still carried faint traces of perfume, something floral that had been popular in the 1980s, mixed with cigarette smoke and the metallic scent of old evidence bags. What interested her most weren't the obvious traces of DNA that had been impossible to analyze in 1987. Hair follicles, skin cells, traces of saliva on cigarette filters, all of these had been carefully preserved by investigators who'd had faith that someday science would catch up to their evidence. But Santos was looking for something more subtle: touch DNA, the microscopic cellular material that people leave behind simply by making contact with objects or other people. The technology had been developing since the early 2000s, but it was forensic genealogy that had truly revolutionized cold case investigation. By combining DNA analysis with publicly available genetic databases, investigators could now identify suspects and victims who had been nameless for decades. The technique had solved cases dating back to the 1960s, reuniting families with missing relatives and bringing closure to investigations that had seemed hopeless. Santos carefully removed a section of fabric from the dress's sleeve, where the original investigators had noted what appeared to be a small stain. Under normal lighting, it was barely visible, just a slightly darker area about the size of a quarter. But under the forensic light she'd brought from upstairs, it fluoresced with the telltale glow that suggested biological material. The sample went to the state crime lab with a priority designation that Santos had to justify in triplicate. Cold cases typically waited months for DNA analysis, but the Rebecca Martinez case had never been officially closed, and Santos had argued successfully that new evidence warranted expedited processing. While she waited for results, Santos spent her days re-interviewing the surviving principals in the case. Tommy Brennan was living in Phoenix, working in residential real estate, and married to a woman who knew about Rebecca but had never pressed for details. He'd agreed to provide a DNA sample for comparison, his voice over the phone carrying the weight of 3 decades of unresolved grief. Jake Brennan had been harder to locate. He'd moved from Cedar Falls to Minneapolis in 2001, then to Denver, then to Seattle, always taking jobs that required physical labor and minimal social interaction. When Santos finally reached him by phone, he'd been working for a landscape company that specialized in maintaining corporate office complexes. "I wondered when this call would come," he'd said. "I always figured someday science would advance enough to solve it. Are you willing to provide a DNA sample?" "Of course, I've got nothing to hide. I loved Rebecca, but I didn't kill her." Sandra Walsh, she'd kept her married name even after divorcing in 2003, had been the most reluctant to participate. She was working as a bookkeeper for a veterinary clinic in Des Moines, living quietly in an apartment complex that catered to middle-aged professionals who valued privacy above community. When Santos called, Sandra had been silent for nearly a minute before agreeing to meet. The crime lab's results arrived on a Thursday morning in March, delivered by secure email with enough encryption to protect state secrets. Santos opened the attachment in her cubicle, surrounded by the familiar sounds of a small-town police department conducting its daily business. The DNA profile was complete and unambiguous, female, with markers that indicated European ancestry consistent with Rebecca's background. But there were also secondary markers, trace amounts of genetic material from at least 2 other individuals who had been in physical contact with the dress sometime around when Rebecca disappeared. One of the secondary profiles matched Jake Brennan's reference sample perfectly. This wasn't surprising given their admitted physical relationship. His DNA would have been expected on her clothing. The second secondary profile was more interesting. It didn't match Tommy Brennan, despite his claims of physical intimacy with Rebecca throughout their engagement. It was definitively female, and it suggested a level of physical contact that went beyond casual social interaction. Santos stared at the results for several minutes, feeling the familiar thrill that came with solving puzzles that had seemed unsolvable. Then she picked up her phone and dialed the number for Sandra Walsh. "I think we need to meet," she said when Sandra answered. "I have some questions about the night Rebecca disappeared. I told Detective Kowalski everything I knew." "I'm sure you did, but science has advanced quite a bit since 1987, and sometimes old evidence can tell us new stories." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Santos wondered if the call had been disconnected. Finally, Sandra spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "How much do you know?" "Enough to fill in some blanks. The question is whether you want to fill in the rest, or whether you want me to piece it together without your help." Another silence, shorter this time. "Where do you want to meet?" As Santos hung up the phone, she felt the weight of 32 years of unanswered questions beginning to shift. Science had provided the key, but it would take human confession to unlock the truth about what had happened to Rebecca Martinez on that September night, when love and jealousy and friendship had collided with fatal consequences. The coffee shop Sandra Walsh had chosen for their meeting sat on the outskirts of Des Moines, the kind of anonymous chain restaurant that could have been anywhere in America. Detective Santos arrived 15 minutes early and claimed a corner booth with a view of the parking lot, positioning herself where she could observe Sandra's demeanor from the moment she walked through the door. Sandra entered precisely on time, moving with the careful precision of someone who'd spent decades controlling every aspect of her environment. At 54, she looked older than her years, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of clothes that suggested someone who'd learned to value invisibility over style. She ordered coffee black and sat across from Santos with her hands folded on the table like a student prepared for an exam she knew she would fail. "You said science has advanced," Sandra began without preamble. "What exactly does that mean?" Santos opened the manila folder she'd brought and removed a photograph of Rebecca's dress, the evidence tag clearly visible in the corner. "Touch DNA. It's a technique that allows us to extract genetic material from skin cells that people leave behind when they come into physical contact with objects or other people." Sandra's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. "And you found something on Rebecca's dress?" "We found DNA from 3 different people, Rebecca herself, Jake Brennan, and a third person, a woman whose genetic profile doesn't match anyone in our database." "But you think you know who it belongs to?" Santos leaned forward slightly, studying Sandra's reaction. "DNA is like a fingerprint, Sandra. It's unique to each individual. If you provide a reference sample, we can make a definitive comparison." Sandra was quiet for several minutes, staring into her coffee cup as if it might contain answers to questions she'd been avoiding for 32 years. Around them, the restaurant hummed with the ordinary sounds of people going about their lives, conversations about work and family, the clink of silverware against dishes, the hiss of the espresso machine behind the counter. "I keep thinking about how young we were," Sandra said finally. 24 years old, like we knew everything about the world when we really knew nothing at all." "Tell me about that night." Sandra took a deep breath, then began to speak in the careful monotone of someone who'd rehearsed a story many times in private, but never told it aloud. "Rebecca called me that afternoon around 3 o'clock. She said she needed to talk to me privately during the party, that she'd made a decision about Tommy and Jake and everything that had been going on. She sounded relieved, I guess, like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. What decision had she made? She was going to break up with Tommy that night, end the engagement, return the ring, tell everyone the wedding was off. She said she couldn't keep living a lie, that she'd realized she was in love with Jake and had probably always been in love with Jake. Santos made notes, though she was more interested in Sandra's body language than her words. How did you feel about that? Sandra's laugh was bitter. How do you think I felt? I was losing my best friend to a man who'd barely acknowledged my existence in all the years I'd known him. You were in love with Jake yourself. It wasn't a question, and Sandra didn't treat it like one. I'd been in love with Jake Brennan since 9th grade. I watched him date other girls, watched him pine over Rebecca, watched him marry her in every way except legally while I stood on the sidelines pretending to be happy for everyone. You followed Rebecca outside that night. She was supposed to meet Jake by the payphone at 10:30. They were going to talk through the logistics of how to tell Tommy, how to handle the family drama, all the practical stuff that comes with blowing up everyone's life for love. Sandra's voice carried a tone of disgust that Santos recognized as self-directed. I got there first, hid behind that old blue pickup truck that belonged to someone's uncle. I was going to listen to their conversation, try to figure out if there was any way to change Rebecca's mind. But Rebecca arrived alone. She was nervous, kept checking her watch and smoking cigarettes even though she'd quit months earlier. She kept practicing what she was going to say to Jake, whispering to herself like she was rehearsing for a play. Santos felt the pieces clicking into place, the careful architecture of truth revealing itself after decades of concealment. What happened when you confronted her? Sandra's composure finally began to crack. I didn't mean to confront her. I was just going to listen and leave. But then she said something that made me so angry I couldn't think straight. What did she say? She said she felt sorry for Tommy, but she felt worse for all the women who would never get to experience real love because they weren't brave enough to take it when it was offered. Sandra's voice broke slightly. She was talking about me, detective. She knew how I felt about Jake, and she was basically saying I was a coward for never acting on it. So you stepped out of hiding? I told her she was being selfish, that she was going to destroy Tommy for a man who would probably break her heart within a year, that she was throwing away security and stability for a fantasy. Santos waited, sensing that they were approaching the crucial moment. She laughed at me, Sandra continued. She actually laughed and said that maybe if I'd ever taken a risk in my life, I'd understand the difference between settling and choosing. She said Tommy deserved better than someone who was marrying him out of convenience, and I deserved better than watching other people live the life I was too afraid to pursue. You argued her. We argued, and the more we argued, the angrier I got, not just about Jake but about everything, about how Rebecca always got what she wanted without trying, while I worked twice as hard for half as much recognition, about how she could have any man she wanted while I spent Friday nights alone watching television, about how even her problems were more interesting than my successes. Sandra paused to drink her coffee, her hands trembling slightly around the cup. I told her she was making a mistake, that Jake would never really love her the way she thought he would, and she said, Sandra's voice dropped to a whisper, she said that even if that was true, at least she'd know what it felt like to be truly wanted, even if only for a while. That's when you pushed her. Sandra nodded, tears finally beginning to fall. I didn't mean to hurt her. I just wanted her to stop talking, to stop being so calm and rational about breaking everyone's heart. I pushed her, and she stumbled backward and hit her head on the payphone booth. The coffee shop continued its normal operations around them, but Santos felt like she and Sandra were existing in a bubble of suspended time, 32 years of secrets finally finding their way to the surface. She was unconscious but breathing. There was blood but not very much. I panicked and put her in my car, thinking I'd take her to the hospital and explain that she'd had an accident. But she died before you got there. Sandra's nod was barely perceptible. She stopped breathing about halfway to the hospital. I pulled over and tried to do CPR, but I didn't really know what I was doing. When I realized she was gone, I just kept driving. Where did you take her? Miller's Quarry, about 20 miles north of town. My father used to take me fishing there when I was little. I knew it was deep and isolated. I weighted her down with rocks and I let her go. The confession hung in the air between them like smoke. 32 years of guilt and secrets finally released into the world. Santos closed her notebook and leaned back in her chair, studying Sandra's face for signs of relief or remorse. Why didn't you tell anyone? Why let Tommy and Jake live with suspicion for all these years? Sandra's answer came in a voice so quiet that Santos had to lean forward to hear it. Because I knew that if I told the truth, Everyone would know what I really was. Not just someone who'd had an accident, but someone whose jealousy was so toxic that it killed the only person who'd ever really cared about me. As Detective Santos drove back to Cedar Falls with Sandra Walsh's signed confession in her briefcase, she thought about the terrible mathematics of human emotion, how love and friendship and jealousy could combine in ways that destroyed everything they were meant to protect. Science had provided the key to solving Rebecca Martinez's disappearance, but it couldn't solve the deeper mystery of why people sometimes hurt the ones they claim to love most. The recovery of Rebecca Martinez's remains from Miller's quarry required 3 days of coordinated effort between local law enforcement, state crime scene investigators, and professional divers equipped for deepwater recovery in October's frigid conditions. Detective Santos stood on the muddy bank as they brought up what was left of a young woman who'd been missing for 32 years, 2 months, and 6 days. The skeletal remains were remarkably well preserved, protected by the quarry's cold water and Sandra's careful weighting with stones that had kept the body from floating to the surface. The powder blue dress had long since deteriorated, but fragments of fabric still clung to the bones, along with the engagement ring that Tommy Brennan had saved 3 paychecks to buy. Rebecca's mother, Maria Martinez, was 81 years old when Santos called to tell her that her daughter's body had been found. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but Santos could hear 32 years of suspended grief finally finding its release in the elderly woman's quiet tears. "Can I see her?" Maria had asked. "There's not much left to see, Mrs. Martinez, but we can arrange for you to be present when the remains are transferred to the funeral home, if that would help." "I just want to bring my baby home." The forensic examination confirmed Sandra's confession in its essential details. Rebecca had died from blunt force trauma to the back of her skull, consistent with striking a hard surface at an angle that suggested she'd been falling backward. There was no evidence of sexual assault or additional violence, supporting Sandra's claim that death had resulted from an argument that escalated into a tragic accident. But the full story, as it emerged through additional interviews and Sandra's complete confession, was more complex than a simple moment of anger, resulting in unintended consequences. Sandra had been planning to confront Rebecca for weeks, ever since learning about the affair with Jake through her own careful observation and detective work. She'd followed Rebecca and Jake to the Stardust Motel on 3 separate occasions, photographing their cars in the parking lot and documenting the times of their arrivals and departures with the methodical precision of someone conducting surveillance. "I told myself I was protecting Tommy," Sandra explained during a recorded interview at the Cedar Falls Police Department. "I convinced myself that I was being a good friend by gathering evidence of Rebecca's betrayal, but the truth was, I wanted proof that she wasn't the perfect person everyone thought she was." The jealousy had been building for years, fed by 1,000 small resentments and comparisons. Rebecca's effortless beauty, her ability to attract male attention without trying, her casual assumption that she deserved love and happiness, all of it had gnawed at Sandra's sense of self-worth until it had metastasized into something toxic and consuming. "She never had to work for anything," Sandra said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of accumulated bitterness. "Men noticed her when she walked into a room, employers remembered her name, teachers gave her extra credit for enthusiasm. Everything came easily to her while I had to fight for every scrap of recognition or attention I ever received." The night of the engagement party had been Sandra's intended moment of revelation. She'd planned to wait until Rebecca broke up with Tommy, then reveal her knowledge of the affair to everyone at the party, exposing her best friend's deception and destroying her reputation in one dramatic gesture. "I had photographs in my purse," Sandra admitted. "Pictures of her car at the motel, time-stamped receipts I'd found in Jake's truck, even a hotel pen I'd stolen from their room. I was going to make sure everyone knew what kind of person she really was." But when Sandra overheard Rebecca's conversation with herself by the payphone, her casual dismissal of Tommy's feelings, her excitement about finally choosing love over obligation, something had snapped inside her. The confrontation had been spontaneous, fueled by years of suppressed resentment and the terrible realization that even in betrayal, Rebecca was more admirable than Sandra had ever been in loyalty. "She wasn't even sorry," Sandra said, tears streaming down her face. "She was sad about hurting Tommy, but she wasn't sorry about choosing Jake. She said she'd finally learned to stop living her life for other people's expectations. And I hated her for it because I'd spent my entire life living for other people's expectations and I didn't know how to stop." The push had been born of that hatred, a moment of pure rage that transformed a lifetime of passive resentment into active violence. When Rebecca fell backward and struck her head on the payphone booth's metal frame, the sound had been sickeningly final, a wet crack that Sandra said she still heard in her dreams. I knelt beside her and she was still breathing, but there was blood coming from her ear and her eyes weren't focusing. I kept saying her name, shaking her shoulders, but she couldn't respond. I knew I should call an ambulance, but I also knew that everyone would know I'd pushed her, that my jealousy had finally turned deadly. Sandra had carried Rebecca to her car, a task made easier by adrenaline and Rebecca's slight build, and driven toward the hospital with genuine intention of getting help. But when Rebecca stopped breathing during the 20-minute drive, panic had overwhelmed Sandra's better judgment. I pulled over at that old farm road about 5 miles from the hospital and tried to do mouth-to-mouth, but I didn't really know what I was doing. When I finally accepted that she was dead, I just kept driving north toward the quarry. I couldn't face telling people what had happened. I couldn't face being known as the person whose jealousy had killed Rebecca Martinez. The weighted disposal had been methodical, almost ritualistic. Sandra had used rocks from the quarry's edge to weigh down Rebecca's body, then waded into the frigid water to push her friend into the deepest section she could reach. She'd returned to the engagement party an hour later, helping clean up and expressing appropriate concern when Rebecca's absence was discovered. For 32 years, I woke up every morning thinking this would be the day someone figured it out, Sandra said. Every knock on the door, every phone call, every time someone mentioned Rebecca's name, I thought it was over. Part of me wanted to confess just to end the waiting, but I was too much of a coward to face what I'd done. As Detective Santos listened to Sandra's full confession, she found herself thinking about the different ways people respond to guilt and shame. Tommy and Jake had both been consumed by their loss, but they'd channeled their grief into reconstruction, new lives, new locations, new attempts at finding meaning after tragedy. Sandra had chosen concealment, spending 3 decades in a kind of emotional prison that had probably been worse than any legal punishment she might have received. The case officially closed on November 15, 2019, with Sandra Walsh pleading guilty to involuntary manslaughter and receiving a sentence of 12 years in prison, reduced for her age, her cooperation, and the extraordinary circumstances that had delayed justice for more than 3 decades. She would be eligible for parole in 8 years, assuming her health held out, and the state prison system could accommodate an aging population of inmates whose crimes had been committed in another century. The truth had finally emerged, but like most truths revealed after long concealment, it brought as much sadness as relief. Rebecca Martinez could finally be laid to rest, but the lives damaged by her disappearance could never be fully repaired. Some wounds, Detective Santos reflected, heal better in darkness, and some secrets are more merciful than the truth they're hiding. Sunset Cemetery in Cedar Falls had changed considerably in the 32 years since Rebecca Martinez disappeared, expanding eastward to accommodate the town's growth while maintaining the established section where older families rested beneath weathered headstones that dated back to the community's founding. On November 30, 2019, a small gathering assembled around a fresh grave site to finally provide the closure that had been delayed for more than 3 decades. Maria Martinez, now 81 and using a walker, sat in a folding chair provided by the funeral home, her weathered hands clutching a rosary that had belonged to her own mother. The autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves and distant wood smoke, the same smells that had perfumed the air on the night her daughter vanished. Tommy and Jake Brennan stood on opposite sides of the grave site, their first time in the same location since their father's funeral 25 years earlier. Father McKenna, who had been a young associate pastor when Rebecca disappeared and was now the senior priest at St. Catherine's, conducted a simple graveside service that focused on God's mercy and the peace that comes from finally laying the dead to rest. The ceremony was private, attended only by family members and the few friends who remembered Rebecca as more than a symbol of tragic loss. Detective Santos observed from a respectful distance, having developed a personal investment in the case that went beyond professional obligation. She'd seen how cold cases could consume investigators, but she'd also experienced the profound satisfaction that came from providing answers to questions that had haunted families for decades. Tommy Brennan had flown in from Phoenix specifically for the funeral, bringing with him a wife who knew about Rebecca but had never asked for details that might resurrect old pain. At 56, Tommy carried himself with the careful dignity of someone who'd learned to build a meaningful life on the foundation of early loss. His construction business had prospered, and he'd raised 2 daughters who'd inherited their father's quiet strength and their mother's practical wisdom. "I'm glad she's finally home," Tommy said to Detective Santos after the service. "I spent so many years wondering if I could have prevented it somehow, if I'd paid more attention or been a better fiancé. It helps to know that what happened wasn't really about me and Rebecca at all." Jake Brennan had driven down from Minneapolis, where he'd worked for the same landscaping company for 18 years, and lived in a small apartment that he'd never felt motivated to upgrade. His life had been smaller than his brother's, more solitary, shaped by a grief he'd never quite learned to process. but standing beside Rebecca's grave, he seemed to find a peace that had eluded him for most of his adult life. "I always thought one of us killed her," Jake admitted to Santos. "Tommy or me, in a fit of jealousy or rage or desperation. It never occurred to me that someone else's pain might have been deeper than ours." Sandra Walsh had written a letter to be read at the funeral, but Maria Martinez had declined the offer, saying she wasn't ready to hear from her daughter's killer, regardless of the circumstances. The letter remained unopened in Detective Santos's case file, another piece of evidence in a story that had finally found its ending. The most surprising attendee was Rebecca's former supervisor from the insurance office where she'd worked after high school. Margaret Fleming was 78 years old, retired for nearly 2 decades, but she remembered Rebecca with the clarity that comes from having genuinely cared about someone. "She was so young," Margaret said to Maria Martinez as the service concluded, "but she had such big dreams. She wanted to travel, maybe go back to school, see what was beyond Cedar Falls. I always wondered if she got the chance to do any of those things." "She did," Maria replied quietly. "Maybe not in the way she planned, but she's finally free to go wherever she wants to go." The burial itself was simple. Rebecca's remains interred in a modest casket that Maria had selected with the same care she'd once used to choose her daughter's prom dress. The headstone was equally understated. Rebecca Elena Martinez, 1963–1987, beloved daughter and friend, finally at peace. As the mourners dispersed, Tommy and Jake found themselves walking toward the parking area together, their first real conversation in over 30 years unfolding, naturally despite the decades of estrangement. "Do you think she would have been happy," Tommy asked, "if she'd lived long enough to break up with me and marry you?" Jake was quiet for several steps before answering. "I think she would have been happy for a while, but Rebecca was always looking for something just out of reach. I'm not sure either one of us could have given her what she was really searching for." "What was she searching for?" "Permission to be herself, I think. Permission to want things and go after them without worrying about who she might hurt or disappoint." They reached their cars, both men reluctant to end a conversation that felt like it might be their last chance to make peace with the past. "I'm sorry," Tommy said finally, "for all of it, for competing with you, for hating you, for letting 30 years go by without talking to you. I'm sorry too, for betraying your trust, for falling in love with your fiancé, for being too much of a coward to tell you the truth when it might have mattered." The brothers shook hands across the decades of resentment and regret, not quite ready for embrace but no longer willing to carry the weight of their mutual anger. They exchanged phone numbers and made tentative plans to stay in touch, though both understood that some relationships can't be fully repaired, only forgiven. Detective Santos was the last to leave the cemetery, standing beside Rebecca's grave as the late afternoon sun filtered through bare oak trees and cast long shadows across the headstones. The case was officially closed. Sandra Walsh was serving her sentence, and the Martinez family finally had answers to questions that had haunted them for more than half their lives. But Santos found herself thinking about the lesson embedded in Rebecca's story, how jealousy and resentment could fester in darkness until they became toxic enough to destroy the very relationships they claimed to protect. Rebecca had died not because she was careless or cruel, but because someone else's pain had grown too large to contain. As she walked back to her patrol car, Santos reflected on the strange mathematics of justice. Sandra Walsh would serve 12 years for a crime that had poisoned an entire community for 32 years. The punishment seemed both too little and too much, inadequate compensation for the lives disrupted by Rebecca's disappearance, but also harsh judgment for a moment of rage that had probably surprised Sandra herself with its deadly consequences. The truth had finally emerged, carried on the wings of scientific advancement and human confession. But the truth, Santos had learned, was often messier and more painful than the mysteries it replaced. Some stories ended with justice, others with understanding, and a few blessed ones ended with forgiveness. Rebecca Martinez's story had ended with all three, which was perhaps the best that could be hoped for in a world where young women sometimes vanished on September nights, leaving behind only questions that took 32 years to answer and grief that would last considerably longer. The autumn wind picked up as Santos reached her car, scattering dead leaves across the cemetery and carrying with it the promise of winter. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell was chiming the hour, marking time's passage with the same steady rhythm that had counted off the years between Rebecca's disappearance and her final return home.